Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a journey into the magical world of fantasy literature,
Oh, yeah.
but with a specific focus: the influence of Welsh language and culture.
A fascinating topic, especially these days.
Right. And we'll be using this BBC article as our guide. It really dives into both the pros and cons,
I think it's something a lot of people are talking about now,
especially with books like A Court of Thorns and Roses becoming so popular.
Exactly. Like, is it really representing Welsh culture or just?
We're just creating like a romanticized version.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today.
Sounds good.
But before we get into all that,
Yeah.
I think we need to go back to the roots of modern fantasy.
Back to the beginning.
Yeah, to Tolkien. I mean, his work is like fundamental to the genre.
Absolutely.
And he was hugely inspired by the Welsh language.
Oh, for sure. And it wasn't just, a casual interest,
I mean, his Elvish language,
especially Sindarin.
yeah, Sindarin,
They're like deeply rooted in Welsh.
like the grammar, the
Yeah,
structure.
Yeah, like even just the sentence structure of Sindarin, it often mirrors Welsh.
Really?
Yeah, you know how the verb comes first?
Well, I see.
It gives it that distinct sound.
Lyrical quality.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
amazing how those details,
They can really shape a whole
a
world.
whole world.
Yeah.
And so many authors were clearly inspired by that, by Tolkien's love for Welsh.
Definitely. But the article raises some concerns about that too.
Right, like about misrepresentation.
Yeah, it's tricky. On the one hand, it's great that Welsh culture is getting more visibility, globally.
Sure.
But there's also the fear that it's being simplified.
Oversimplified.
Yeah, or reduced to just like,
Mystical tropes.
exactly. Like
Right.
it's just all dragons and magic.
Right.
And that's not the whole picture at all. The article quotes this bookseller, Bethan Hindmarch, who talks about this.
Oh, what does she say?
She's worried that Wales is being portrayed as this, like solely mystical, rural place.
Yeah, it's like that danger of a single story,
Fascinating.
overshadowing the whole reality.
Right. And it's not just about accuracy. It's also about how it impacts people's perceptions.
And that ties into this whole rise of romanticy.
Oh, yeah. The Court of Thorns and Roses and all that.
Yeah, it's bringing in a ton of new readers to fantasy.
Which is great.
But then it raises the question of, like, how is that influencing the image of Wales?
Especially for readers who might not know much else about it.
Right, exactly.
It's a lot of responsibility for authors.
And the article is very clear about distinguishing between, like, works inspired by Welsh culture versus those claiming to be, authentically Welsh.
Huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, authors need to be upfront about that, about their intentions.
Totally. It's about respect.
And then there's this whole thing about pan-Celticism.
Oh, yeah. That's a tricky one.
It's a new term for me, actually.
It's basically like lumping all the Celtic cultures together, Irish, Scottish, Welsh.
As if they're all the same.
Exactly. And it erases the uniqueness of each culture.
So it's not enough to just say Celtic.
You got to be specific.
Right, like acknowledge the nuances.
Totally.
Otherwise, it's just a jumble.
A big Celtic mishmash.
Exactly. And this is especially important when it comes to language.
Right.
The article talks about authors just using Welsh words. Because,
So they like the sound of them,
yeah, without
really
really
understanding the meaning.
or the context.
Exactly. And that can be really misleading for readers.
It's like, I don't know, using a word from another language as decoration.
Without bothering to learn what it means.
Yeah, and that's where sensitivity readers come in.
They're so crucial.
They can help avoid those kinds of situations.
Yeah, like I was reading about how author Rebecca Yarros had to apologize for mispronouncing Scottish Gaelic names in her book.
It just highlights, like, the importance of doing your research.
Absolutely. Collaborating with people who actually know the culture.
So important.
It's not just about avoiding mistakes. It's also about celebrating the good stuff.
The positive portrayals.
Yeah, like the article mentions Morgan Is My Name.
By Sophie Keach.
Yeah, and Welsh fairy tales, myths, and legends.
By Claire Ferris.
Those are great examples of authors who are clearly doing the work.
Researching, being sensitive.
Yeah, and it shows those books really capture the spirit of Welsh culture.
That's great to hear. But what about the bigger picture? How does all of this impact how people around the world see Wales?
That's such a good question. I mean, with fantasy literature, it's global.
Yeah.
So these stories have the potential to really shape people's understanding of a place, even if they've never been there.
It's like those travel books,
Kind of, except it's a fantasy world that's sparking curiosity about a real culture.
So authors and publishers have a big responsibility
Absolutely. They need to be mindful of that.
to present a balanced view.
Avoid stereotypes.
Yeah, really promote a deeper understanding. So, like, going back to our initial question, is fantasy accurately representing Welsh culture?
I think it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
It's a spectrum.
Yeah, some books do it well, some don't.
It's up to us as readers, I think, to be aware of these things.
To engage critically.
Yeah, and support creators who are doing it right.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of examples, I think it's time we talk about A Court of Thorns and Roses specifically.
Okay, yeah.
It's become, kind of central to this whole discussion.
It's a great example to dive into.
So buckle up, everyone. We're going deep into ACOTAR
Let's do it.
and how it's handling these Welsh-inspired elements.
Should be interesting. Okay, so ACOTAR, right off the bat, you've got names like Rhysand
Rhysand, yeah.
and Gwyneth.
Very Welsh-sounding.
And it's that subtle
It
thing.
makes you think of Wales.
Yeah, even though Sarah J. Maas, she hasn't explicitly said it's based on Welsh culture.
But those names, plus all the mystical
It
elements.
makes readers connect it,
Right. And that's where things get tricky.
because it's just one aspect.
Right. It's not the whole picture of Wales.
And that can be misleading, I think.
Reinforcing stereotypes.
Exactly. You can't judge a whole country based on a single postcard.
Right. And I couldn't find anything about whether Moz, did a ton of research.
Or worked with sensitivity readers.
Yeah. But it makes you wonder,
How is this affecting how people see Wales,
especially those who've never been there.
Especially those who don't know anything else.
Right. It's a lot of power.
And ACOTAR is huge.
Oh, massive, especially on TikTok.
So that portrayal, those Welsh elements, they're reaching so many people.
It's a big responsibility.
It is.
And it goes beyond just accuracy, I think.
There's the question of appropriation.
Right. Like if an author is profiting.
Right. But not acknowledging the culture.
Or giving back.
Yeah, that's ethically problematic.
Like taking something without asking.
Basically.
So besides sensitivity readers, what can authors do?
I think just be transparent.
If you're using a culture, say it.
Acknowledge it.
Put it in the author's note.
Do your research. Talk to people from that culture.
Show some respect.
Yeah, be a good literary citizen.
Contribute to a better understanding.
Exactly. And readers, we need to be aware too.
Ask questions.
Talk about these things,
Have those discussions.
We can all make things better.
Yeah, it's about being informed.
About the books we love.
So, okay, ACOTAR is one thing, but the article also mentions
Some good examples, yeah.
books that do a good job with Welsh culture.
Morgan Is My Name.
By Sophie Keach.
And Welsh Fairy Tales, Myths and Legends.
By Claire Fairs.
Those are great.
They clearly did their homework.
It's not just about getting the facts right.
It's about capturing the spirit,
Totally, the nuances.
the richness of the storytelling tradition.
Yeah, Welsh culture isn't just decoration in those books.
It's woven in.
It's part of the story.
It makes it more authentic.
And it gives readers a real glimpse into the culture.
That's what good storytelling can do.
Transport you.
Introduce you to new things.
Make you think.
Challenge your ideas.
Exactly.
So, back to our question.
Is fantasy representing Welsh culture accurately?
I think we've learned it's complicated.
It depends on the spectrum.
We need to be discerning.
As readers, as consumers of culture.
Support the creators who are doing it right.
And speaking of the bigger picture.
We talked about global reach earlier.
Yeah, those international perceptions.
Imagine someone in Argentina who's never been to Wales.
Reading a book.
And that's their whole impression of the country.
That's a lot of power.
It is.
So we need balance, nuanced views.
Avoid those stereotypes.
And promote understanding.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
Building bridges.
Connecting people.
True stories.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive.
We want to spark those conversations.
Challenge those assumptions.
Make you think deeper.
Empower you.
To be part of the conversation.
About culture, representation, all of it.
And you know what? Let's turn it over to the listeners now.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you think?
After learning all this,
About Welsh culture and fantasy.
which books, which authors are doing a good job?
And why?
Tell us what you think.
Share your thoughts. Start a discussion.
Keep the conversation going.
The more we talk about it, the better.
We become more informed.
More empowered.
But we're not done yet. In our final segment,
We're going even deeper.
we're going to look at the history of Wales.
That often gets overlooked.
It's a fascinating history,
Full of conquests, resilience,
and it's shaped everything.
the language, the myths, even the landscape.
Get ready for a trip back in time.
It's going to be eye-opening.
Stay tuned, everyone.
And get ready to explore.
Okay, so we've talked about the language, the myths, But now I think it's time to dive into the actual history of Wales,
Yeah, the real world history.
because it's fascinating.
It really is.
And it's often, like, overshadowed by all the fantasy stuff.
Yeah, you get caught up in the dragons and magic.
But the history is just as captivating, I think.
It's like, peeling back layers.
Like an archaeological dig.
Yeah, you have the surface, but underneath,
There's a whole other story.
centuries of, like, conquests and resilience,
And it's all there, and the language, the mythology.
even the landscape.
So where do we even start?
Well, you can't talk about Welsh history without talking about the Romans.
Oh, yeah, right.
They didn't fully conquer Wales, but
They left their mark.
big time. You still see Roman forts and roads all over Wales.
It's amazing. Like,
These structures have seen so much history.
we should change.
And the Roman influence goes beyond just, physical stuff.
Like what?
Their language, Latin, had a huge impact on Welsh.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy to think that Welsh, a Celtic language, has these traces of Latin in it.
It's like a secret ingredient.
Kinda. It shows you how languages evolve.
They mix and change.
Yeah, and the Romans are just one part of it,
Right. There are the Saxons, Vikings, Normans.
all leaving their mark
It's like a tapestry.
with all these different threads.
And within that, you have all these historical figures.
Events that have become, legendary.
Like King Arthur.
The classic fantasy hero.
His story is rooted in that post-Roman period.
Yeah, a time of huge upheaval.
It's thought that the real Arthur, if he existed,
Might have been fighting against the Saxons.
so those stories of knights and chivalry
Could be based on real battles.
is like fact and fiction blending together
Which is what makes us so interested.
to uncover those connections,
It adds a whole new layer of meaning.
like a hidden code.
Exactly.
And it makes you realize, like, these stories,
They reflect real human experience.
the struggles, the triumphs,
Doubts and fear.
and the Welsh, they've had their share of struggles.
But they've always, bounced back.
That resilience.
That's incredible.
They held on to their language, their culture,
In the face of, everything.
and that spirit is in their stories.
That's what makes them so powerful.
So behind every fantasy novel, every myth,
There's this rich history.
and when we explore that history
We understand the stories better.
and the people who created them,
That's what we've tried to do today, I think.
yeah, on this deep dive,
Encourage you to look deeper.
beyond the surface,
Find those connections.
we've talked about the language, the culture,
The myths, the history,
how it's all intertwined with fantasy,
and how important it is to be aware,
to ask questions,
to be conscious consumers of culture.
and to keep exploring.
Yeah, that's the key.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you learned something new.
And that it sparks some new ideas.
Keep those imaginations firing.
And keep exploring those incredible stories.
Until next time.